When was it?
That was 2020. Yeah, so great.
What volume? I gotta go look this up. Okay, that's okay. That's huge. That's huge. Congratulations. It's like amazing. So.
Yeah, that was very unexpected.
It's good work. Who was your advisor?
Pat Sullivan.
Trisha Sullivan?
Patricia Sullivan.
Yeah. She does put that.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I know her.
You know.
Yeah, lift every voice, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, I know her. That's amazing. That's also amazing. Who else was on your committee?
Can't hear me.
Gosh,
Yeah,
that's amazing
was,
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Robert Thomas Leakin. Yeah, he's pretty much the only argument.
Okay.
Maybe.
Wow. Well, just Patricia Sullivan, Pat Sullivan, and Ken Germany. I mean, that's huge. Right?
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yeah, they're really very hopeful.
Hey, Meridian. This is one of our recent MA students who's just completed her master's thesis and is now going to the University of Memphis for her Ph.D.
Awesome.
Yeah. Isn't that a great program for she's doing civil rights?
Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm very proud of them. Great. Yeah, so she's my advisor.
Oh.
Very excited. This is Susanna Ural, who is in the history program. She's our civil rights historian, but also our digital humanities director. Great historian extraordinaire.
Thanks for making time tonight.
Did you go to the religion chapter? What?
Thank you for your kind intro.
Oh,
Running out of steam.
I think that's what I was trying to say. I think a lot of us are kind
There's
of
like
there.
multiple things, and I'm like, I want to be at this one, but I don't have energy for this one.
Yeah. Check that vote too. So there we go. Hi, are you guys students?
Yeah, it's for the honors forum.
Oh, you
So
are?
yeah, we're doing this for one of the electives.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, tell your friends to come on. Hi, Andrew. This is another Andrew. We have a few Andrews in our program.
Sorry.
You join our ranks. So this is Andrew Haley, who is our a modern U.S. historian, cultural historian. I'm a food historian, lots of wonderful things. So. Did you go to the religion talk?
I did.
Okay. Thank you.
Picked a busy day to do this.
I know, I'm really sorry, and I have grad class after this too, so it is busy.
I'm looking for it.
Well, I guess. We'll give them one more minute. Make sure everyone who's trying to go on to WebEx really can. Okay, guys, well, we're a small but mighty crowd. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for attending tonight's lecture by Dr. Gutkowski, The Poisoned Land, Hazardous Waste, Civil Rights, and the Struggle for Environmental Equity in the U.S. South. Thank you guys who are here in the audience, and also those of you on WebEx, thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Rebecca Turry. I'm a co-director along with Dr. Douglas Bristol, the Center for the Study of the Gulf South at the University of Southern Mississippi. The center was founded in 1999 and promotes the history of the U.S. South, Central America, and the Caribbean by supporting Southern Miss history faculty research about the Gulf South, hosting public events, and sponsoring other historical organizations in and around Mississippi, including the Gulf South Historical Association, the Mississippi Book Festival, and Mississippi History Day. Before we begin, if you're on WebEx, please remember to keep your microphones muted throughout the entire presentation. And also, please note that we will not be able to see your questions in the chat immediately, but at the end of Dr. Gutkowski's presentation, I will monitor those and then ask anything you might have in the chat. So please just put your questions in the chat, and then I will pose them to Dr. Gutkowski at the end of this presentation. Okay. And now, Dr. Andrew Gutkowski is an assistant professor at USM in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, where he teaches courses in environmental justice, social advocacy, and Black studies. He has a Ph.D. in history from the University of South Carolina in 2020. I just found out that Pat Sullivan was his advisor, and also Kent Germany was on his team. Great civil rights historians, with concentrations in modern U.S., African American, and environmental history. His current book project explores how post-war struggles over civil rights and industrial pollution in the U.S. South shaped the uneven distribution of environmental hazards, toxic waste facilities, Superfund sites, brownfields, that defines much of the region's industrial landscape today. His research has recently been published in the Journal of American History. So, without further ado, thank you, Dr. Gutkowski.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming and being present here. Thank you especially Rebecca and everyone else at the center for putting this together, organizing this, taking interest in my research. I'm excited to share it with you. My name is Andrew Gutkowski, as you know. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies currently, and just recently arrived in the fall. So I'm a newbie here. An environmental historian whose work explores the history of hazardous waste disposal and facility siting in the U.S. South, with a particular focus on issues of environmental justice. Today, I'll be introducing my book manuscript project, The Poisoned Land, Hazardous Waste, Civil Rights, and the Struggle for Environmental Equity in the U.S. South, which examines the history of environmental racism and the history of the environmental justice movement as it has unfolded in the American South. Now, environmental racism is a very broad category. My project specifically focuses on the unequal distribution of hazardous waste facilities. It seeks to explain how and why a disproportionate number of the South's hazardous waste sites have been externalized onto African American neighborhoods. And it also examines how communities of color since the 1970s and 1980s have mobilized against this spatial pattern, mobilized against discriminatory siting, and transformed Southern environmental politics, American environmental politics writ large in that process. To tell the story, my project uses an interdisciplinary approach. On the one hand, it re-examines the history of chemical manufacturing, hazardous waste management, and civil rights struggle as they unfolded in the 20th century South. And on the other hand, it incorporates GIS as a tool for modeling how minority neighborhoods, communities of color have often been used as a path of least resistance for citing hazardous waste throughout the modern South's history. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I will be focusing primarily on one case study for my project. My book project will be a series of case studies. Specifically, I'll be talking about the African American neighborhood of Arkwright, which is located on the south side of the city of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg is a city in kind of the upcountry, northern, mountainous portion of the state, that kind of historically the textile manufacturing belt of the state of South Carolina. In the year 2000, Harold Mitchell, who's shown here pictured on the left, an environmental justice activist from Arkwright, welcomed a delegation of South African activists into his neighborhood in the city's south side. The leader of the delegation was visiting to discuss strategies on how to confront environmental inequality across national boundaries. Prior to this meeting, Mitchell had been crusading for South Carolina state officials to investigate a series of toxic waste sites located in his neighborhood. Standing along Sims Chapel Road, which runs adjacent to two Superfund sites directly next to Mitchell's home, Mitchell described to the delegation how decades of unrestrained growth, industrial pollution, and unequal waste management practices had transformed his neighborhood, the neighborhood of Arkwright, into a toxic community. He warned, quote, neighborhoods can become what we call environmental or toxic ghettos, pointing to a series of decaying steel drums, junk cars, and concrete slabs that litter the former city dump, a mere 50 feet away from his home. Mitchell's choice of words here, that neighborhoods can become toxic ghettos, was crucial because it highlights the fact that environmental racism has a history. It has a history that can be traced and understood. And so the question becomes, how do neighborhoods become toxic in the first place? And more specifically, why is it that communities of color, as numerous studies have shown since 1980s and 70s, are disproportionately burdened by environmental hazards in the United States? This question that Mitchell poses here gets to the heart of my book project. Now, this connection between the placement of hazardous waste facilities and race was first analyzed in a systematic nationwide fashion in the 1980s by the United Church of Christ Racial Justice Division and their landmark study, Toxic Waste and Race, which is pictured here. In this study, the UCC analyzed the social geography of over 18,000 hazardous waste sites spread across the United States. And what they found was that there was a strong proximal correlation between the distribution of these hazardous waste facilities and race. More specifically, the authors concluded in this study that 3 out of every 5 Hispanic Americans and African Americans living in the United States live in communities that harbor toxic waste sites. Now, this was a staggering statistic in its own right, but it merely identified a correlation. The UCC had merely demonstrated that race correlates strongly with the presence of environmental risks In Hazardous, it did not say anything about the issue of causation. It did not explain why this correlation exists or how it came about in the first place. Now, why does understanding causation matter? Causation is essential to understanding not only how environmental racism works in practice, but also how we can go about addressing its effects in the present day. In terms of public policy, causation matters because the Superfund program, which is the law the EPA still uses to clean up these contaminated sites, hinges on the question of liability. Part of this process, as the diagram here shows, involves something called cost recovery, which means determining who the responsible parties are. Who was the previous owner of the site? Who was responsible for handling hazardous substances? Those parties are then legally compelled to pay for the cleanup process. But determining liability is often extremely difficult. In the case study that I'm going to show today on Spartanburg County, the city of Spartanburg was responsible for mishandling a waste disposal site next to Mitchell's neighborhood, the Arkwright community. But the city denied any culpability for decades, making it impossible for the community to achieve environmental justice. Indeed, it was not until after the Black community became organized in Spartanburg and applied grassroots pressure that the city finally was forced to admit its culpability. Causation also matters when we consider how environmental racism is still treated by the courts today. The prevailing judicial understanding of environmental racism is based on the principle of discriminatory intent. In other words, in the eyes of the courts, racial discrimination only exists if intent can be proven, that a community is being intentionally targeted with the placement of hazardous waste facilities because of its racial makeup. This principle, however, has historically made it extremely difficult for environmental justice communities to achieve redress through the courts alone, because the causes of environmental racism are often subtle, they're multi-causal, they're structural. When we better understand causation, then it also becomes clear that the courts are an inadequate and often unlikely vehicle for effecting change. Rather than simply seek redress in court, causation demonstrates that activists must focus their efforts on reforming the very political and social mechanisms, the institutions that create and recreate environmental inequality. A process that requires empowerment, requires community activism and grassroots organizing. And finally, causation also allows us to develop a more rigorous understanding of how environmental racism works in practice. This is important because environmental justice researchers have often struggled to explain causation. One explanation is that Black neighborhoods are deliberately sought out for the purpose of citing toxic waste. Now, while this theory is correct to emphasize the role of racial discrimination, it doesn't tell us much about the underlying structural mechanisms, about how or why minority communities often become the paths of least resistance. The alternative view is that race is incidental to the placement of hazardous waste sites. These scholars argue that market dynamics are the real reason why communities of color are often chosen to house hazardous waste facilities. They argue that disposal firms are solely motivated by profits and therefore seek sites that are inexpensive for conducting business, which incidentally happens to be minority neighborhoods. But this argument fails to explain how or why cheap land values became tied to race in the first place. In other words, why minority communities are undervalued to the extent that they become seen as profitable spaces for housing toxic waste. This is the intervention that my book project is trying to make. It argues that environmental racism must be viewed as a socio-spatial process, meaning that it emerges out of this complex interplay between race and urban space that unfolds over time. Looking at the South specifically, I argue that these siting disparities are the products of the geographic legacies of Jim Crow. They do not simply emerge from market dynamics. They are a product of the South's deeper legacy and history of racial zoning, residential segregation, and the exclusion of Black communities from state and local politics. These geographic legacies, I argue, are crucial in creating the underlying conditions that made Black communities vulnerable to discriminatory citing, while also insulating White communities from similar levels of risk and exposure. Now, why focus on the city of Spartanburg as part of this project? The map shown here helps to answer this question. This is the spatial distribution of environmental hazards in Spartanburg County in the year 2000, same year Harold Mitchell invited the South African delegation to visit his community, Arkwright. The red shaded areas represent predominantly African American neighborhoods, whereas the green shaded areas represent predominantly white communities. And what we see is that these hazards obviously are not distributed evenly across the community, across the county. Rather than, there is an intense concentration of Superfund sites, brownfields, and toxic release inventory facilities located on the south side of the city, where the majority of Black residents live, where Mitchell's neighborhood is also located. Another reason Spartanburg offers a powerful case study example in studying environmental racism has to do with the city's economic and industrial history. Since the 1980s, Spartanburg has been heralded as a success story or an experiment in supply-side economics and neoliberalism, a kind of a symbol of the Sun Belt South in a sense. During the mid-20th century, the city underwent a dramatic industrial transformation, moving away from a previously textile-based economy to a more diversified and globalized economy. And the city achieves this transformation largely by courting foreign investment from Western Europe and Southeast Asia with a system of tax incentives and regulatory giveaways, and by resisting local unionization efforts. The city revitalizes itself during the mid-20th century by embracing the promises of globalization, the promises of neoliberal economic freedoms, earning the praise of conservative economists like Milton Friedman, who famously featured Spartanburg in his TV series Free to Choose in 1980. But the problem with this view is that Spartanburg's economic transformation unfolds unevenly. The costs and benefits of this free market approach are not distributed equally throughout the city, as the community of Arkwright illustrates here. Now, when Mitchell welcomed the South African delegation into Arkwright, the community was home to two Superfund sites, the former city landfill and an abandoned fertilizer plant. To place this pattern into perspective, in 2000, there were only two Superfund sites and 11 brownfields recognized by the EPA in the entire Spartanburg metropolitan area, and all of them were located in the community of Arkwright. The community was also overwhelmingly, around 95%, African American. And as the land use map here indicates, there were no zoning controls in place, no buffer zones in place to separate residents from these sites. The purple shaded areas are industrial properties, while the yellow shaded areas are residential. As you can see, the community is immediately adjacent to these hazards, largely because Spartanburg planners resisted for decades the idea of adopting a county-wide zoning plan as part of their industrial recruitment strategy. And because of Arkwright's close proximity to these sites, the community has experienced an unusually high incidence of cancer, lymphoma, birth defects, and other seemingly inexplicable health problems. So what do these sites look like? I've included a few images in these slides from EPA's administrative file on Arkwright to give you some examples. This first set of images is of the old fertilizer production plant, formerly operated by International Minerals and Chemicals Incorporated, or IMC. Now, the IMC facility was closed after the company downsized in 1986, and it was supposedly labeled as an air quotes clean closure by the state of South Carolina, meaning that the facility had been secured and was made free of hazardous materials. But as these images show, that was clearly not the case. In fact, when the EPA investigated the site over a decade later, they found drums of sulfuric acid and toxic sludge left over on site. South Carolina state officials had never actually visited the site. Essentially, the company had externalized and had been allowed to externalize by the state the cost of deindustrialization, the cost of properly closing the facility onto the Black community of Arkwright. In this next image, you can see chemical waste leaking out from the bottom of the facility into the surrounding groundwater in Arkwright. Some of which, as this image shows, flowed off-site into nearby streams and ditches. The EPA estimates that some 1.2 million gallons of toxic waste were allowed to leak off-site into the surrounding groundwater. And water samples collected near Arkwright showed elevated levels of pesticides and dioxins in the groundwater. This next image is of the other Superfund site, the city dump that was discovered in Arkwright. The community was actually used for about 30 years as the main repository for all the city wastes, medical, municipal, construction, all categories of waste were dumped here in Arkwright because there was no oversight structure ever put in place to monitor what was going into the landfill. As you can see, this practice made the site essentially unusable over time. Trees unable to take root because the waste is so heavily compacted into the earth. And because the city never bothered to create an adequate lining to cover up the landfill site, hazardous waste was allowed to leak further into the surrounding groundwater from the dump site. So how did Arkwright, going back to Mitchell's praise, become a toxic neighborhood in the first place? The origins of Arkwright's environmental crisis, they actually date back to what historians call the New South period, so around the turn of the century. This is when the Arkwright community was founded, and it is when Black residents were first excluded into unhealthy living in workplaces. Now, many of these contaminated sites were not located in Arkwright due to explicit racial bias. They actually emerged from a wider expansion of textile manufacturing in Spartanburg County that began in the 1890s. This is when textile manufacturing first became ascendant in Spartanburg, and the reason it becomes ascendant has to do with the region's ecology and geography. If you look at the map shown here, you can see that during the New South period, Spartanburg was a railroad hub. 3 railways radiated outward from the city center, providing crucial freight access to distant markets in Atlanta, Richmond, and Charleston. But the more important factor here was geography. If you all look carefully at this map again, not only do you see these gray lines that represent railways, you will also see a similar network of waterways in the foreground as well. These blue lines that represent rivers, creeks, and streams. In the eyes of industrial recruiters at the time, these waterways were an invaluable ecological resource. They offered a potential source of hydropower that could turn massive waterways and power textile mill units. So what happens is, beginning in the 1890s, the city of Spartanburg industrializes. It witnesses a massive influx of northern investment taking advantage of these geographical resources, leading to the formation of massive textile mill towns along the outer edges of the city, in areas where waterways and railways would intersect. This is exactly how the Arkwright community was born. It emerges along a node where water and railways met, providing the economic engine for textile manufacturing in the area. This is why the IMC facility settles there. It has to do with economic rationality primarily. But race does become an important factor when we examine the demographics of the community more deeply. When we examine the historical census data on Arkwright, what becomes clear is that this was a segregated community from the very beginning. These are census tracts from the 1940 census in Spartanburg County. The red shaded areas represent predominantly African American census tracts, whereas the blue shaded areas are predominantly white. As you can see, Black residents are disproportionately concentrated on the eastern side of the village. This was a product of both social custom in state law. In 1912, the South Carolina state legislature mandated that African Americans be excluded from working in textile mills throughout the state. The statute profoundly shaped the social geography of the Arkwright community. Because Black citizens were excluded from access to mill labor, they were also prohibited from purchasing homes either subsidized or owned by the mill company. As a result, Black residents there were forced to settle in areas closer to the more hazardous fertilizer facility. What made the IMC facility more hazardous was not just the fact that the plant was eventually used to store chemical waste, it also had to do with the fertilizer production process itself. By constantly grinding and pulverizing phosphate, the factory repeatedly engulfed the nearby Black community of Arkwright in acidic caves, likely containing traces of hydrochloric acid and silicon tetrafluoride that corroded surrounding homes and would poison the air. Here are a few examples from interviews that I did with local residents. Harold Mitchell, who grew up immediately adjacent to the fertilizer plant, remembered how emissions from the facility, quote, would cause my mother's eyes to swell with tears and make it so she could hardly breathe. At one point, the fumes destroyed the screen covering my family home's front door. You could touch the screen and it would be brittle, like potato chips crumbling in your hands, like it was corroded, quote. Environmental inequality also extended into the workplace as well. Remember that Black residents were not allowed to work at Arkwright mills, so many found jobs in the IMC facility. According to one IMC worker, Herbert Dubois, well, workers at the plant had to wear towels across their noses, with only their eyes exposed to protect themselves from the dust and fumes. But you would still get a burning sensation down your throat, and when you got up in the mornings, it was hard to breathe. And so from the very beginning, we see how race is playing a determinative role in shaping the geography of pollution in Spartanburg, and especially the geography of pollution in Arkwright. It's not that Black residents choosing to live next to these facilities, they are being channeled by social custom and also by state law into these hazardous spaces. But the problems don't end there. The IMC facility, as I referenced earlier, was just one of these Superfund sites ailing the Arkwright neighborhood. The siting of the Arkwright landfill, city dump, also illustrates how the legacies of Jim Crow are influencing the unequal distribution of hazards in Spartanburg County. Beginning in the 1940s, the city began to face a trash problem, largely due to a population boom that began to stretch the city's municipal boundaries further outwards. Previously, the majority of the city's waste was uncollected and unregulated. It was simply burned or buried in privately owned dump sites scattered across the urban landscape. But as the city increasingly industrialized, increasingly suburbanized, clear that a new waste management regime was needed to keep pollution at more tolerable levels. And so initially, the city council approved the construction of a waste incinerator shown on the map here, located on the northern side of the city. The problem with this approach, however, was that it did nothing to actually reduce the increasing volumes of waste being produced by the city. It merely converted that waste, the solidified waste, into a gaseous form that tended to inundate nearby predominantly white residents in a haze of smoke. As a result, those white Spartanburg residents began organizing petitions and demanding that the city develop a different kind of waste management scheme. In response to that public pressure, the city council adopted a new method, the sanitary landfill method, which involved isolating and compartmentalizing the waste underground beneath the soil cover. The problem with that approach, however, was that it merely reconverted the waste back into a solidified form again. And more importantly, it required that all the city's waste now be concentrated in a single location. And where you place that location becomes a serious source of controversy. Throughout the 1950s, the city struggled to find a suitable location for its new municipal landfill. According to the Spartanburg Herald Journal, city officials desired, quote, a large site at low cost, located within easy distance of the city, one that would require only short trips for trucks and minimum fuel consumption for carriers, quote. So the city initially relied on a cost-benefit analysis to shape the siting process. In fact, the city council initially proposed locating the landfill next to a white suburb, the Park Hills neighborhood shown here on the southwestern portion of the city. This proposal, however, was met with vehement resistance, protest from white residents in Park Hills. The city then considered an alternative site located along the municipal airport, also shown on the map. But business leaders resisted, claiming that the airport was a crucial access point into the city of Spartanburg for foreign investors, and a garbage dump there would tarnish the city's image. Indeed, resistance from both white suburbanites on the one hand and the business community on the other ultimately pressured council members to find a more politically expedient location for the city dump. And so in 1954, the city council chose Mitchell's neighborhood, the community of Arkwright, and more specifically, they chose the African American portion of the Mill Village. And the reason they chose Arkwright is captured very well in this quote from the Herald Journal. In 1954, the newspaper praised the city council for locating a site, quote, where odors and smoke will not cause a nuisance to residents. A city dump is a necessary evil, but it should be in a location where it will cause the least inconvenience, quote. As these assessments indicate, the Arkwright community was virtually invisible in the landfill siting process. In the face of mounting white resistance, the city council chose the path of least resistance, making Arkwright an easy target. Now, all this is not to say that there was no community pushback during this period. There was indeed resistance, but it's important to emphasize that residents in Arkwright and Black residents throughout the city had few ways to actually make their claims heard because they'd historically been disempowered. On the one hand, the white power structure in Spartanburg had proven adept at subduing Black protests and keeping Black citizens out of positions of power within the city. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, during the height of the civil rights movement, the city successfully blunted the impact of local civil rights efforts by adopting a strategy of partial accommodation. This strategy involved occasionally offering symbolic concessions to the Black community, say by hiring a few Black police officers, modestly increasing the salaries of Black teachers, which the city did several times during the 1950s. And although these were important concessions, they were part of a larger strategy designed to maintain the city's power structure, to maintain the city's image as being, air quotes, racially progressive without completely dismantling the system of segregation. And so while school desegregation does arrive in Spartanburg during this period without significant resistance, Black residents continued to be excluded from positions of power in the city well into the 1980s. According to Roy Henderson of the Spartanburg NAACP, quote, we marched to protest the racism and discrimination that was festering in the public safety and all other departments of the city. But when we approached them for a chance in the form of an election to produce a more inclusive city council that would be more representative of our Black citizens, we were rudely told over and over again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, quote. Another challenge that Arkwright residents faced was that industry, specifically IMC, was very skilled at silencing their complaints and protests. According to Harold Mitchell, quote, my neighbors would repeatedly raise their concerns to the city council and the State Department of Health, but the company kept telling us that this was a harmless fertilizer plant, that was just a place for fertilizer that was used for growing things, quote. At one point, the company went as far as replacing its family's car after the fumes had completely corroded away its painted exterior. All this began to change in the 1990s. In 1993, when Mitchell first began investigating the strange odors and inexplicable illnesses that were destroying his community. After returning back to his hometown, after pursuing his football scholarship at the University of South Carolina, Mitchell was alarmed to discover that many of his neighbors had passed away from a seemingly common thread of illness. According to Mitchell, quote, about everyone who lived on my street had died, and they were dying from the exact same type of respiratory problems, that or lung cancer, end quote. In 1997, Mitchell's father also began to experience similar symptoms, eventually passing away and succumbing to his illness. According to Mitchell, quote, on his first test, they detected lymphoma in him. It was the same thing killing the rest of my community. The cancer basically just raced through him, end quote. After his father's death, Mitchell began to connect the noxious fumes and these mysterious illnesses together. He began first by investigating the unexplained death of his infant sister decades earlier, whose cause of death had never been identified. According to Mitchell, quote, I looked at my sister's death certificate, which I'd always had doubts about. I took the certificate to a coroner outside of Spartanburg, and I asked him what was the cause of death. She had only lived for a couple of hours because it was difficulty breathing, quote. Mitchell was shocked to discover that she'd actually died from chemical poisoning, likely sulfur dioxide, which had been used historically in large quantities by the IMC facility to create fertilizer. At this point, Mitchell became convinced that IMC was somehow connected to the death of his family members and neighbors, but he still couldn't quite prove how. So in 1995, he visited the South Carolina Department of Environmental Control and began combing through the state's file on the IMC facility. He was shocked to discover that, quote, the plant had never been given a proper shutdown, probably because it was too expensive. Looking at the closure plan, it was not accurate because I grew up walking with the night watchman throughout the facility. A lot of what I saw in the files was just totally inaccurate for the site itself. So that's when the red flags began to go up. And he learned, for example, that IMC had never passed its state emission tests, and IMC had been using the facility to house hazardous waste for years. Shocked by these findings, Mitchell immediately contacted EPA, who followed through with an investigation of the facility. According to Mitchell, quote, they pulled up and immediately saw that this place was not secure. There was at least about a knee-high of sludge on the floor. You could see footprints right next to the tanks, where kids had been recently playing, end quote. According to the EPA site assessment, approximately 48 tons of superphosphate fertilizer had been left behind, and elevated levels of pesticides and dioxins were identified in the creek and groundwater. Now, the EPA's investigation provided compelling evidence that both of these sites posed an immediate public health threat to the community. However, it was not clear to residents how the community should proceed. The toxic contaminants were just one side of the problem that they were facing. There was a lack of commercial development, a lack of jobs, a lack of affordable housing, a lack of green space and recreational facilities. All of these things were bound up in the issue of environmental racism, or symptoms of environmental racism. Residents were also indignant to learn that the state and city had essentially used their neighborhood as a dumping ground for years. But Mitchell was careful to steer the community away from relying solely on litigation in the courts to achieve environmental justice. Instead, he steered the community towards a different method, a process that involved a combination of grassroots pressure on the one hand and building multi-stakeholder partnerships on the other. In 2000, he founded Regenesis, a community organization dedicated to pursuing a comprehensive revitalization of the Arkwright neighborhood. The goal is to simultaneously address each of these crises afflicting the community, the infrastructural challenges, the economic challenges, and the public health crisis. To pursue this model, Mitchell began by tapping into veterans of the Spartanburg civil rights movement, help get buy-in from local churches and civil rights organizations. With their support, he began hosting a series of community forums where anyone could meet and discuss neighborhood problems, at one point drawing in as many as 1,400 participants. For the first time, Mitchell recalled, quote, we became one voice, electing our members to city council and sending in petitions to the EPA. Quote. Ultimately, this combination of grassroots pressure and federal intervention became too much for the city to ignore. In 1999, the city council officially accepted responsibility for both citing and failing to properly secure the Arkwright landfill, offering to set aside funds to redevelop the area. The EPA also awarded Regenesis an $850,000 grant to help revitalize the community and allowed Mitchell's organization to serve as a central decision-making body in determining where and how those funds would be allocated. This allowed Regenesis to pursue its vision of a comprehensive revitalization. As the South African delegation toured Arkwright in 2000, Mitchell took pride in the successes of the Regenesis model. Since Mitchell led this toxic tour of Arkwright, his stewardship has secured for the community a new civic center, a free healthcare facility, affordable housing units, and a new shopping district. As of 2021, the former city landfill is also being redeveloped into a solar power farm. Reflecting on Regenesis' struggle in the community's thriving revitalization project, Mitchell calmly asserted, quote, "It was like environmental justice was a pebble we dropped in a pond, and all these other things that have come of it are like ripples spreading out from that one spot." Before I conclude, I want to just briefly outline some of the future directions for my book manuscript project. As I noted in the introduction, Arkwright is just one of the series of case studies that I'm looking at for this project. One case study I envision exploring further in the near future as part of this project focuses on a series of predominantly Black communities near the petrochemical landscape in Lake Charles in southwest Louisiana, home to one of the largest concentrations of polyvinyl chloride or PVC manufacturing facilities in the world. Since the 1960s, the wetlands surrounding Lake Charles have been seriously impacted by the illicit dumping of chemical waste into nearby lagoons, rivers, and bayous. Historically, these waterways were used by petrochemical firms as an industrial sink for diluting and flushing out chemical waste, a practice that tended to deoxygenate the water, suffocating aquatic and marine life alike, while also leaving discolored streaks and oily residues that destroy fish stocks. In response, local residents and environmental activists have gradually pressured industry to seek disposal outlets further inland into Black communities located along the outskirts of the city, communities that formed and emerged in the aftermath of Reconstruction. Ultimately, this chapter will describe how this increasing public opposition to stream pollution combined with the privatization of the hazardous waste disposal industry transformed the geography of pollution in southwest Louisiana, concentrating waste into Black neighborhoods there. Unlike Arkwright, this community study will also place a greater emphasis on the roles of women in transforming environmental politics in the South, especially women of color. And nearly all of these hazardous waste struggles in Louisiana, a common theme I've noticed is that women were often the first to scrutinize waste disposal firms and to challenge the state's ability to monitor and control these sites. In this chapter, I will argue that women of color leverage these issues, their identity as mothers and caretakers of family, to challenge their historical exclusion from state and local politics. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those, and I appreciate any feedback, criticisms. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Questions?
Sure, Andrew. So I thought it was a really interesting talk. Thank you. And I learned a lot. I'm curious if that while racism served as racism contributed to the locating of toxic waste sites in Black neighborhoods and whatnot, if perhaps in recent years the Black community's experience of racism has empowered them in ways that that better prepare them to deal with the challenges. So I'm thinking, I'm not phrasing this question very well. I wasn't quite ready with it. Yeah, but I'm thinking like things like a history of civil rights organization, if that didn't prepare them for this, a willingness to turn away from unhelpful local and state governments to federal agencies that come of the civil rights movement as well. That there aren't, and maybe just a kind of the kind of reliance on the community that you see in Black communities that maybe has made them better prepared to deal with it than perhaps white communities are at this point, if that makes any sense.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's exactly the theme. I observed that exact theme in Spartanburg, and I've seen that similar theme play out in other Southern environmental justice communities I've looked at for this project. There's consistently a kind of, I guess, a sort of historical lineage between the civil rights movement and environmental justice, where a lot of these groups are tapping into like deeply rooted social institutions that go back to that period and relying on some of the exact same figureheads that help mobilize and lead the civil rights movement to these similar struggles over toxic waste. I think one of the bigger, differences, probably the biggest differences I noticed, there was just greater participation. There's more space, I think, than I guess communities of there's more women of color taking leadership positions compared to kind of the larger civil rights movement, or at least women are getting more like kind of a prominent space and recognition usually in the struggles than they often were in the civil rights movement by comparison.
That's fascinating. I mean, I'm thinking that your timing might be partially responsible for seeing more women involved. When were most of these environmental justice movements erupted?
Usually the earliest that I've observed are kind of the mid 70s, but they really kind of escalate late 70s, early 1980s.
I have another question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I was really fascinated by this idea that in the 1950s and 60s in Spartanburg, the kind of white community leaders gave some sort of concessions to the Black community in an effort to sort of moderate the movement or the kind of, and it sounds so similar in many ways to it's not exactly the same as Hattiesburg, but there certainly are parallels in the efforts of the city leaders to try to like present and moderate sort of front. But I was wondering if you see that most of these sites that you're looking at are in places that sort of are perceived as these moderate New South success stories, and what you think might be the reason for that, or if that is not a pattern.
I think that is a pattern that I'm beginning to see in my other case studies, but also, and I guess the pattern is just tied to these heavy reliance on foreign investment, historically northern investment, and the need to kind of shed away that image of like the South as always being the backwards place in the Laura region in comparison to the rest of the country.
Andrew, you mentioned something about kind of solar farms coming in and kind of taking over some of these areas. Is that always seen as a good solution, or are there sometimes concerns with potential environmental impact of even solar farms and things like that as a better alternative? But I was just kind of curious if the community is just going to be suspicious of anything, understandably.
So I haven't followed up, I think, on the most recent changes in the community. So I can't really, fully answer that question. I'm not sure how the solar farm portion has been embraced in the community in Spartanburg. That's a really good question, something worth, checking into for, for part of that particular portion of the book project. That's a great question, though.
One more, I'm sorry. I see that one of your examples is talking about water, and another one's talking about land, kind of concern about the land. Are there tensions between different communities that want toxic waste moved to land sites versus so the ones in Louisiana versus Arkwright that is concerned about? Do you see tension between the different places or solutions, I guess, that are approached?
Yeah, I tried to cast with a kind of a wide net with this project and look at a variety of different geographies, parts of the South, all of them having the common theme of being highly industrialized. But that is an interesting question, and something I think to look at further down the road. I haven't really seen attention, but part of the idea was to try to look at a variety of different kinds of geographies that exist in the South.
Feel free to not answer this question.
Okay.
Just because it's out of the blue. But so have you had a chance to look at the community you're now teaching in? In particular, I'm curious about the Hercules play here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen, I've noticed that, and I've had that mentioned to me a few times by the folks around here. So I am interested in adding another case study from Mississippi to this, again, to cast a wide.
There's more than one choice.
Yeah,
Right.
obviously.
Yeah. And the Superfund cleanup just finished at Hercules, like a year and a half ago. So why did it take that long for this plant that shut down around the same time as what is it?
Right.
The fertilizer plant. I mean, I think there definitely are, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, that would definitely be really interesting to look at, and to add to the project. Thank you.
Any questions from WebEx? I guess. Okay, all right, well, thank you so much, Andrew.
It's nice meeting you all too. Thank you.
Welcome to
Thank you for
Southern
your
Mass.
questions. I appreciate it.
I'm sure it's been a